Good afternoon and welcome to Space Center Houston on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. My name is John Charles. I'm your moderator for this very interesting and exciting panel. I am a retired NASA employee. I left NASA after about 30 plus years of civil service employment, and I became the scientist in residence here at Space Center Houston. But my job for this panel is not to be a scientist, it's to be more of a historian and help you appreciate the significance of the scope of the effort of Apollo, the Apollo program, Apollo 11 in particular, but the rest of the Apollo program, which could not have been successful if it did not end successfully. And the panel we have here today is the panel on command module landing and recovery operations. You know, they always say that the job's not over until the paperwork's finished. Well, the job is not over until the spacecraft is floating in the Pacific Ocean and the astronauts are successfully retrieved. We have with us today 4 heroes of that era, people that I looked up to and admired as a 14-year-old watching on television back in 1969, and I really, really wished I could be with them in the Pacific Ocean helping retrieve those astronauts. We have with us here on the panel, to my left, Denny Holt, we have Milt Heflin, we have Mel Richmond, and we have Terry Watson. Instead of me introducing each of them, I'd like for them to say just a little bit about themselves, and then we'll get into some questions from me, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. So Denny, why don't you get us started? Tell us a little bit about who you are, how you got to be involved in this business, what you did for Apollo. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. I got here in June of 1967, 5 days after graduating from Tennessee Tech in Cookeville, Tennessee, which is just outside the Appalachian Poverty Zone. And I couldn't wait to get here because I needed to make some money. And went to work in the landing and recovery business at that time as in the training world. But I'll let these guys talk to you about what it's like to be out on the recovery ship during an actual recovery. The recovery effort was global, and I spent all my time in the wrong ocean, riding airplanes or recovery ships in contingency landing spots. So, but I spent 2 years in recovery during that time, and then moved off into the flight control world, and retired from NASA after 35 years. And spent about 15 years consulting. So that you can do the math on that, but I'm 74, and I was one of the children of Apollo.
Let's see, first of all, is Deb Coons in the audience here? Deb? Oh, she was trying to get in here. I was hoping she'd be here. I wanted to embarrass her. She's the daughter of the man that hired me, and that was on in 1966. I showed up here on 6/6/66. Retired in 2013. Yeah, there's a story about the sixes. We probably don't have time to tell you, but maybe we do. But anyway, so I was hired by Wayne Coons, and Deb's dad, and he lives in Kansas now. Health is not that good. He was the Marine Command chopper pilot that picked up Alan Shepard in May of 1961. Very, very special guy. So I've been at 8 splashdowns during Apollo. Fast forward, I was on the splashdown during the Orion return, unmanned Orion spacecraft that just went out a long ways and came back. So I was on a Navy ship that recovered Orion in the 2014, yeah. So I had fun with that because when I left the team, and I'm consulting with the Kennedy Space Center, who is in charge of landing and recovery like we used to do. And so when I left the team, I made the comment to him, I said, this is my 9th splashdown, and I'm still 8 ahead of you. And I hope you can catch up. After that, I became a flight controller for the approach and landing test of the space shuttle. That's how I learned console operations. I worked as a flight controller in 4 different positions in mission control during the first 9 missions of space shuttle, and was very fortunate to be selected as a flight director 1983, and supported 20 space shuttle flights as a flight director, 7 of those as a lead flight director. And the most fun I ever had was, by luck of the draw, I got to be the lead flight director for when we went back to the Hubble and restored its vision. So that was a big thing. Really enjoyed that. Beyond that, I guess if you're good at something, they like to kick you up into management. And so I probably had 5 or 6 different management jobs. I won't mention them all, but I was chief of the flight director office for a while, which was, and I was on duty. I was there when we lost Columbia, and I was chief of the office. So that did happen on my watch. And I ended up my career working for Mike Coates in the center director's office. They made a special job for John Young when John could no longer fly, even aircraft, and it was called Director Technical of the Johnson Space Center. They created a job for him, and he basically was the eyes and ears of the center director, and operations and safety and that sort of thing. Well, that job was vacant for about 3 or 4 years, and Mike Coates asked me if I would come and take that job, and I said, you know, and he said, replace what John Young was doing. I said, oh, I can take that job, but I cannot replace John Young. I've been blessed with a lot of different things in this business, and with a lot of these guys, and it's been really a hoot and fun. So I guess I need to leave some time for the rest of you to.
Well, I came to NASA in 1965 after 4 years as a weather officer in the Air Force. The first job I had after I got here had probably been about a month. I was told to go to Hawaii and get on a ship out there. So the first night I was in a hotel in Waikiki Beach, and I said, I think I'm going to like this job. And that night I was on a destroyer, and I said, I don't think I'm going to like this job. And that was Gemini 6, and the target failed to deploy, and so I got to come home. But I spent most of my career in recovery. The agreement with when NASA was formed that the Department of Defense was responsible for recovery, and so all the Navy and Air Force did all the recovery, but they constantly changed people. So NASA was responsible for showing them how to do it, developing the equipment for them to do it. Writing the requirements for each flight, tell them how many airplanes and where to be and what ships and where to be. I was not here during Mercury, and I know they had a lot of ships out in the ocean, a lot of airplanes. Finally, by the time Apollo and Apollo Skylab was over, I think we had 1 ship, and that was the prime ship. During that period of time after I got here, I was responsible for writing the requirements for the Department of Defense. I didn't do it by myself. A lot of people had inputs into it, and it developed as we went along. After each mission, we learned more and had more confidence in the spacecraft. So I wrote the requirements for Apollo 7, 9, 11, 13, and I think I wrote the rest of them, but I don't remember. I was on the recovery ship on Apollo 9, and I was on the recovery ship on 11, 13, 17, and 3 Skylabs. And on the Skylab, I was the NASA team lead, which was it was a good job. And after Apollo and Skylab was over, we no longer had water landings, so I was in training of flight directors and flight crews. I could say I was training them, but I wasn't. I was just giving them stimulate for them to work on the problems. And it's pretty much everything that we did. You could say you did it, but you were really part of a team. Everybody did their part. I guess what you'd like to know is what did I do on Apollo 11? And as I said, I was on the recovery ship, and I was kind of the NASA trajectory guy and knew about the mission. And so I was assigned to the NASA office on the ship, which was right next to the Combat Information Center. And we spent about a week going through exercises, throwing the boilerplate over. No, we didn't throw it over, we dropped it into the water. And then steam off and have the airplanes home in on the beacon, and the ship would drive up, and a helicopter would drop the collar and the raft, and then we would pick up people, pretend they're astronauts, drive the ship up, pick up the command module, put it on the ship, and then go through all the procedures that we would do during a regular flight when they came back. I was thinking about it this morning, it was sort of a thing that you did for a week out there practicing all this stuff every other day with all the people, and then the day of the flight, it just happened. The spacecraft was going to come back, and you were going to do your part, and everybody else was going to do their part, and it all worked out because you had done it so many times. And I guess the only thing that I remember most about it is when the astronauts got off the helicopter, went into the mobile quarantine facility. President Nixon came down and stood in front of them, talked to them. I was standing about 10 feet behind Nixon. I remember that so much about the flight. I also remember that I was a courier for some of the film that was shot on the moon, and I remember bringing it back. I came back commercial, and I was checking in with the airlines, and they said, we want to x-ray this film. And I said, well, I don't think so. We hassled a while, and finally, I said, I'm not leaving this film, and you can't x-ray it. And so he let me go. And I know I came back, and I must have given it to somebody, but I don't remember who. And I guess that's kind of what my career has been. Thank you.
Let's see, I graduated from Georgia Tech mid-year, like February of 1967, and I had been going on various job interviews for engineering jobs, and none of them were very exciting. I mean, they were exciting a little bit, but you'd go off to Huntsville, Alabama, and go to some thigh call or something, and they'd say, this is Fred, and this is Joe, and this is Charlie, and this is where we go to eat lunch every day, and here's the lab. And I'd interviewed with NASA and didn't hear anything back, and they came around on campus again, and I went up and talked to them. They said, oh, you should have heard something. They originally talked to me about working with crew training and writing checklists for the astronauts and such, and I thought that would be great. One day I got a call from a man in landing recovery and said, hey, we want you we want you to come out to Houston, work in Landing Recovery Division, travel around the world, fly around on Air Force planes and get on Navy ships and see the world and all this stuff. And air travel back then was really expensive. I don't think I'd been on actually flown on an airplane until one of my job interviews. It's not like it is today. And so this job had a big adventure checkbox next to it. And I said, how much is this going to cost me? And they, no, we're going to pay you to do this. And I'm thinking, what could be better? So I came out to Houston to the Land and Recovery Division, thought right out of college, great degree, I'm going to show these people, how to do things right. And you find out, you walk into your first job and you're the dumbest guy in the office. So it was a lot of learning experience going on. And I worked mainly in the control centers, so I got to spend a lot of time in the recovery room next to the Mission Control Center, and also went out to some of the DOD recovery centers. Worked a little bit on the mobile quarantine facility. We took it out for 10 days at sea, a test trial, so we were quarantined for 10 days. That's a whole nother story. Ended up on the recovery ship on Apollo 10 with Milt Heflin over here, and actually I was kind of bored on the ship a little bit. I said, Milt, is there anything I can do to help you out? And he says, great idea. He says, here, read this book. You can power down the spacecraft and pull all the stuff out of it, and help seal up the thrusters and everything. And I'm going, wow, this is incredible. Lest you think it was a really exciting job. Part of the job was cleaning out the waste management system and bagging all that up for the. Of course, it was scientifically important for the doctors to know what was going on with astronauts in space. So they studied everything. So I think my job was better than theirs. But so anyway, came back after that. I thought, oh, one thing I should mention: you have never lived until you have crossed the equator on a Navy ship. It's a big ceremony for the first-timers. If you were in a fraternity and ever went through Hell Week, doesn't compare to what the Navy had for you. Very interesting experience. I carried that shellback card for years. I was not going to go anywhere without that shellback card.
How many shellbacks are in here? Raise your hand. Any shellbacks in here?
Any shellbacks?
A few. Yeah, there's a few. Okay.
Anyway, after Apollo 10, I felt like, is that all there is to recovery? I felt like I wanted to do more. I had spent a lot of time next to Mission Control and saw what I had friends that were in Flight Control Division. So somehow I came back from Hawaii and immediately was in Flight Control Division and never looked back. Started off in one of the back rooms, worked my way up as a GNC. I was the lead GNC on Apollo 16 and 17, and also on the ASTP, the Apollo Soyuz mission. Skylab, I worked the GNC console. I think I was the only, in the GNC area, I think I was the only guy that I worked the GNC job on the Skylab vehicle, and I also worked the GNC job on the Apollo spacecraft. So quite often I'd do 2 shifts in a row where we'd be doing a launch or a reentry or something and such. And I have to say, it was a really great experience. Worked with some of the greatest people I've ever known in my career. But after that, after the Apollo program died off, it was after we stopped flying, it was space shuttle, and the whole environment changed. Things became very different, so I felt it was time to move on. So I went out to the West Coast and did a stint with JPL for a little while, Jet Propulsion Labs. Didn't like them at all. After you worked in real-time ops in Houston, where everything is right now, and then you go in an organization that's done by committees of PhDs that take a week to decide anything. I just felt like I was trying to swim through quicksand or something. It was a very different process. But I don't want to belittle it because they do really, really good work. Their whole role was very different, but it just didn't have the action or the excitement that we had in Houston, I didn't think. So I ended up moving to TRW, where I ran the mission operations on a number of NASA satellites, Gamma Ray Observatory, the Chandra X-ray telescope, and some other satellites that I can't talk about. So.
Good. All right, well, thanks. That's a good introduction to the breadth and scope of the panel members here. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get the discussion started, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. The first question really relates to the fact that I understand Apollo was a global recovery requirement. There was the spacecraft could conceivably splash down or thump down any place in the world, but the landings always seemed, at least to me, to take place in the middle of the Pacific at dawn. What was the planning that led to that kind of uniformity of recovery location and time, and what other factors might have influenced that? And maybe Mr. Richmond can start, and then everybody else can chip in as you see fit.
Well, the beginning of the Apollo program, to make planning easy, they drew a line right down the middle of the Pacific Ocean and one right down the middle of the Atlantic, but that actually it had to be kind of crooked the way the Atlantic is located. And so the planning was to time it so the landing would occur one of those two places. And it just depended on how fast you wanted to come back from the moon and where the Earth was turning, where it would land. And there was, I guess, more ocean in the Pacific, so the name for that went for that one, which was a straight line. And it was
And
pretty
Mel, that was like a longitude line, right? It was
straight
depicted-
longitude line, yeah.
Yes.
And
And
it was
anywhere along that, depending upon the mechanics. Yeah.
It depended on where the moon was in its orbit around the Earth, whether it was up here or down here, where it would land along that line. Go ahead.
One of the reasons for the early morning landings, particularly in the Apollo, the moonshots, was when we landed on the moon, one of the requirements was to have the sun, I believe, around 20 degrees off the horizon. So you had slant lighting. You didn't want the sunlight coming straight down on the moon. So the dates of the moon landing were fixed based on where the sun was going to be relative to the Earth and the moon. And when you fixed that, then you fixed where the sun was going to be in the Pacific at the end of the missions. So, the way you all might have seen the figure 8 loop around the moon, which was the free return trajectory. If we didn't land on the moon, you could go around the moon and come back in a figure 8, and that put the landing zone on the side of the Earth opposite the moon. So you ended up in the South Pacific partly because of the way the moon lighting was. The sun was the Earth, Moon, Sun geometry controlled a lot of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as I said, the landing depended on where the moon was at the time. Like Apollo 13 wound up way down south near Samoa, and Apollo 11 was up close to Johnson Island, which is a few hundred miles from Hawaii. And Hawaii is a good place to leave from also.
And I had the privilege of being in the Atlantic for Apollo 8, which was the first lunar return. And of course, the primary recovery ship had about 5,000 people in a small city out there, including the technologists, guys from engineers and technicians from Rockwell and all the world's press, and a cast of thousands. And Randy Stone and I were on a troop carrier in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and we had one of these metal suitcases that had a recovery strap in it and a couple of throat plugs and a recovery manual. So we were the early return. You could get back to the Atlantic about 12 hours quicker. So if you really needed to get back early and not do all the primary recovery, then the Atlantic was your place. And we started out, that was in December of '68. We were right around the equator, and had the mission slipped, we would have been as far south as Montevideo, Uruguay, just based on what the difference in the trajectory was. And so when we didn't end up as far south as Montevideo, Uruguay, the captain of the ship was somewhat perplexed as to why he didn't get to have liberty in Montevideo, the Buenos Aires, and Rio de Janeiro. He had a very nice end of his career tour planned, and we interrupted it. But we did get into Rio de Janeiro. And one other thing is, in the day, today, you're so used to picking up your cell phone. People are so used to even talking to their friends who are and family who are deployed in Afghanistan. The communications in the day in '68 were not that. So we were on a recovery ship. Randy and I were two single guys, and this was around Christmas time. We had no idea. We knew why we were there. Everybody wanted to be with their families, and we were single, and 23 and 24. And so we got in the middle of the Atlantic. We were told we got a Twix in that said they'd launched. We got another one in that said they checked out okay. They got another one that said translunar injection was okay. We got another one that said things were going. We got a daily one that said they were okay. Then we got one that said they'd gone into orbit around the moon. And so basically, we had no clue as to what the mission looked like until we got home and put into Rio de Janeiro and saw Life magazine with the big pictures of the Earth on the front and a big spread on what had happened. And the only problem was it was in Portuguese. It took us a while to find one.
Okay, with that, let's see if there's any questions in the audience. Anybody have any questions about recovery operations on Apollo for these gentlemen? Yes, please, in the back. Yes, sir. Yes, let's discuss for Apollo 11, the quarantine. How many people from the recovery team went into quarantine with the astronauts? Actually, it was two.
Well, we had a doctor, and then the gentleman that would be basically responsible for the mobile quarantine facility operation. So we had two inside the mobile quarantine facility.
And if that's what you mean, there was just 5 people inside the mobile quarantine facility, John Hirosaki and Bill Carpentier, the 2 folks from the recovery team, and then the 3 astronauts. Yes, the question is, was there any consideration to having the USS John F. Kennedy be the prime recovery carrier for Apollo 11?
I can't speak for the Navy, but I suspect not. I've thought about it somewhat since then. It seemed like we were mostly given ships that were about to be mothballed. So once the flights were over, these ships seemed to disappear from the inventory. But they worked well for what we needed them for.
Mothball made me think about the Ticonderoga we used on Apollo 16, Apollo 17, and then the first Skylab recovery. And then that was it for the ship. And when we came back, what I remember is that I kept seeing old gray desks and chairs and just a lot of furniture taken to the fantail and thrown into the ocean, because that was the ship's last sail and they were getting ready to decommission it. And by the time we got back into the West Coast, I don't recall what we got into, but that big old carrier was, it was really high in the water. They dumped a lot of weight coming back.
Please. One more time, please. Good questions. Can you tell us a little bit about your feelings about being involved in the recovery of Apollo and Skylab missions?
If I understand, okay, so there was a difference in that, and I hope I'm answering your question. Skylab was a longer duration mission, and so there was concern the condition of the crew once they splashed down. And so at that time, we decided that we would leave the crew inside the command module and pick them up instead of they get out and get into a helicopter. They could have still done that if we needed to, but that was just because we weren't really knowledgeable enough to know what the condition of the human body would be for 50 some days or whatever it was. Did I even get close to your question, young lady? So
The question
Denny says the answer is no. And I don't know what the question was.
And was really, how did it feel to be part of the recovery team?
Yeah, Terry, you ought to answer that one.
I guess what you're asking is how do I feel about it? Well, depends on what position I was doing at the time. The first time I was out, it was Apollo 9. The weather was terrible. The captain never came around. The press was terrible. I threw up in my boss's stateroom. And I was very happy to be off of that ship. Apollo 11 was kind of an adventure. That one I went through the shellback ceremony. Apollo 11 was, a very big deal. I had a little better job, I think, and I guess I felt like it was part of a bigger thing at the time. I was just, I don't know how to explain it really. It's just a kind of a worldwide operation. But the thing about it, and Denny was talking about it, the only information we had was when we'd get a message from Houston about what was going on. And of course, the military only passes the minimum of information. And when the landing occurred, I think we were listening to Voice of America or something like that. Everybody else was watching it on TV and everything. So I just felt like I was doing my job at part of a big thing. And then after that was over, I told my boss, I said, I don't want to go out on those ships anymore unless I'm going to be the leader. And they said, okay, you don't go. And then when Skylab was coming up, which was first was a month long, and then 2 months, and then 3 months, and I think my boss thought that he didn't want to go out there all that time, and they said, well, Mel, you're going to do all of them. But before you do, you got to go on 17. I said, well, okay. And so I had a different position on that. I was a deputy team leader then, and on Skylab I was a team leader, and a lot more responsibility, and I don't know if I say I enjoyed it, but it was a different kind of a job. Go ahead, Terry.
I'll take a little different take on that. I worked in recovery for a couple of years, and I tell you, everything I did, it was excitement. I mean, I was like 21, 22 years old, traveling to different places, out on recovery ships. It was just bliss. It was just the coolest thing. I'd sit there and I'd go, I can't believe that they hired me to do this job. How did I get so lucky? And I think all of us were really lucky in that respect. I think most of us, we were just in the right place at the right time. Wasn't anything special, I don't think, about us. It was the opportunity presented itself. We took advantage of it, and we were part of a bigger thing.
I was blessed to have been associated with Navy, Air Force, and Marines, who were basically the DOD that made up the team. I really liked what I did during that time because what I learned being around our military, what I learned was command and control, dedication, which I think has served me well through my entire career. I never have been in the service, but I feel like that experience, I'm so glad I got that experience because it made such a big difference to me. The camaraderie and all these units that we worked with, it was just remarkable. It just made you feel good.
The one that I was blessed to be at the Cape for the first Saturn V launch, and recovery wasn't treated like everybody else. We were in the old Mercury control room, which is over on the Air Force Station side. There was no lock on the door, and the room was in pretty rough shape, but it was functional. And we were all squeezed in, and I was sitting there, and it was a 3-rev test of the heat shield in the Saturn V. So at T-9, the guy I was with, Rip Kirby, and to this day I'm in his great gratitude, said, "There's no reason for you to sit here and listen to all this. Why don't you run outside and watch it?" So I had the privilege of standing on a little reviewing stand just above the sagebrush and palmetto down to Cape when the first Saturn V lit off. And about a minute later, you could see the sound knocking down, the standing wave knocking down the brush coming across there. And I've heard shuttle launches from a lot closer. And the Saturn V, the only thing that anybody down there that have seen them, they've compared it to is an earthquake. It was incredible sound. And that was in November of 1967. I'd only been here about 5 months, and that hooked me for 50 years. So.
We got time for one more question. Yes, sir. Question is, how has technology advanced, advanced technology from the 60s to now made the job easier, or has it made it easier?
I may have a good example of that. I'm on a very modest consulting contract with Kennedy Space Center, helping observing the Kennedy Space Center landing and recovery team. And it's a double-edged sword, in my opinion. There were a lot of things that we did back in the day to where, I'm 26 years old, and I'm on an aircraft coming back with the Apollo 11 command module from Pearl Harbor all the way back to Houston, and I'm the senior NASA official on board that plane at 26. And it was almost everything we did was relatively simple. Lots of stories here I'm not going to go into, but so today, what I see is that the technology that these young men and women have available to them are really super tools. That's a huge difference. I mean, there's a number of things that you could work on, and you would have, back in those days, it was a matter of just going out and trying something, and if that didn't quite work, well, real time, try something else, and you basically were in charge of getting things done. Today, there's a lot more overhead in what we do. Chris Kraft, I had a conversation with Dr. Kraft when I was chief of the flight director office, and he asked me about how things were going out there at the Johnson Space Center, and specifically in operations. And Dr. Kraft, of course, is the man that invented the business of mission control. And I was wanting to tell him that I thought that the men and women that showed up, this is like 10 years ago, that the men and women that showed up to do this job today, I felt they had the fire in the belly that we had back in those days. They actually had the fire in the belly, if given the chance to use the fire in the belly. And as I'm trying to, and so what I wanted to tell Kraft was, I thought that the teams that I see today working in mission control are probably just as good as what he had back in the day. And as I'm trying to make my point to him, as I'm getting ready to tell him, I said, Dr. Kraft, I got to tell you, the men and women in mission control today are, and he said, stop, Milt, stop. Now, this is Dr. Kraft who invented this business. And I'm thinking, I'm about to get my head handed to me by Dr. Kraft. He said, Milt, he said, no, they are better than we were. And they're better because of the tools they have today. And I'll guarantee you, this country could do this again as long as they're given told to go do it, get what they need to go do it, and then everybody else who doesn't have a clue how to get it done, get out of the way.
I know you specifically asked about technology, and when I left here, I worked with a lot of unmanned satellite work, and I can tell you that the technology we have today is orders of magnitude better and smaller and quicker and more efficient and does 10 times more than what we had in the Apollo era. For example, in Apollo, we were always taking star sightings to correct the attitude, to refine the attitude of the spacecraft. Now satellites typically have autonomous star trackers that just look at the stars themselves, and they tell the satellite what the attitude of the spacecraft is, with no ground intervention, whatever. We had an inertial measurement unit on Apollo. And we had gyroscopes that were strap-down gyroscopes that also was a backup attitude control system. And as a GNC, we always kind of looked down on the strap-down system because it was rude and crude. Well, I tell you, 99% of the satellites in orbit today don't have IMUs, and they have strap-down systems, and they're really, really good. Hubble Space Telescope, all these satellites use things like that and precisely point and such. So miniaturization of computers, that's just huge. The Apollo computers were little magnetic cores that were wrapped with hair-sized wires, and the programming was coded by which way the wires ran around the cores. And if you wanted to make a software change the Apollo computer, it was a big deal. They had to change the wiring of all the, so it was just a major thing. So technology is huge. It certainly should make the job easier. I don't think politics and all that other stuff makes the job any easier, but certainly technology is worlds ahead.
I'll give you an example. And I mentioned before that we had landings in the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, airplanes all over the world, lots of ships. And now for Orion, no matter where the moon is, they're going to land right off of San Diego. No matter what the trajectory going or coming, is it going to land in San Diego because of the increased knowledge of the atmosphere. The guidance is so much better. Back when we were doing it, we were worried about the spacecraft coming back and maybe hitting the atmosphere and skipping out and going back into space. They don't have to worry about that anymore because the guidance is so good. So technology has changed a lot of things in that aspect.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap up this session. Thank you very much. And yep.